The Xerathi Empire had perfected the art of galactic dominance with the sort of methodical efficiency that would make a Swiss clockmaker weep tears of pure envy. Across 47 star systems, their crystalline ships hummed through space with the quiet confidence of beings who had never met a problem they couldn't solve with superior technology and an appalling amount of paperwork. Their society functioned like a well-oiled machine, assuming that machine was designed by obsessive-compulsive engineers who color-coded their morning routines and filed their dreams alphabetically. For 3 millennia, the Xerathi had maintained their position as the galaxy's premier civilization through a combination of ruthless pragmatism and technological innovation that bordered on the mystical. They possessed cities that floated in perfect geometric formations, weapons that could rearrange matter at the molecular level, and a bureaucracy so advanced it could process invasion permits in under 6 standard galactic hours. Other species either bowed to their superiority or found themselves diplomatically encouraged to explore career opportunities in other dimensions. Then came the Dissolution Protocol. Even by Xerathi standards, it was a masterpiece of destructive engineering. The weapon operated on principles that made quantum mechanics look like finger painting. It could unravel the very bonds holding matter together, reducing entire starships to their component atoms in the span of a heartbeat. The effect was rather like watching someone pull a loose thread on a sweater, except the sweater was made of reinforced titanium and the thread was the fundamental forces of the universe. One moment, a ship existed in all its metallic glory. The next, it was a cloud of confused particles wondering what had gone wrong with their career plans. The first demonstration had been conducted on a derelict asteroid mining facility in the Kepler drift. The Xerathi High Command had invited representatives from 12 major civilizations to witness what they diplomatically termed a technological advancement presentation. The asteroid, roughly the size of a small moon, and possessed of the structural integrity that had kept it intact for roughly 4 billion years, had simply ceased to exist when the protocol engaged. Not exploded, not vaporized, not even dramatically reduced to rubble. It had just stopped being. The assembled diplomatic observers had watched this display with the sort of stunned silence typically reserved for watching someone successfully perform brain surgery with gardening tools. The Kelhari delegate had actually fainted, which was particularly impressive considering their species had evolved without a centralized nervous system. The Vorthak representative had attempted to take notes but kept missing the paper entirely. A nervous tic that suggested their confidence in their own military capabilities had just taken a rather substantial hit. Within 72 hours of the demonstration, 17 different species had submitted formal requests to join the Xerathi sphere of influence. 3 others had simply packed up their home planets and relocated to different galaxies entirely, citing urgent business elsewhere in the cosmic neighborhood. But the galaxy, as it turned out, was not entirely populated by species with functioning survival instinct. The emergency session convened at Research Station Omega-7 was a masterclass in multi-species panic management. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, a massive ring-shaped structure that housed the galaxy's brightest scientific minds in what could generously be described as organized chaos. Representatives from 23 different civilizations had gathered in the main conference chamber, creating a cacophony of clicking, whistling, and electromagnetic frequency modulation that would have driven a human linguist to drink heavily and consider a career change. The Zephyrian delegate, a gaseous being whose emotional state could be determined by the color of their containment field, had shifted through approximately 47 different hues in the past hour, settling on a particularly agitated shade of purple that suggested they were considering either flight or explosive decompression. The crystalline hegemony's representatives sat in perfect geometric silence, their faceted form reflecting the chamber's lights in patterns that somehow managed to convey deep existential dread. For 3 months, the assembled scientists had been working on a counter-solution to the Dissolution Protocol. They had approached the problem with the sort of collaborative enthusiasm typically reserved for group root canal procedure. The results had been correspondingly spectacular in their failure. The Kelhari had attempted to create a stabilization field using their mastery of biological manipulation, producing only a substance that smelled remarkably like rotting fish and had occasionally achieved sentience. The Vorthak had tried to overwhelm the protocol with brute mathematical force, generating calculations so complex they had accidentally created a small black hole in Laboratory 7, that was still being diplomatically ignored. The Zephyrians had contributed gaseous compounds that theoretically could interfere with quantum dissolution, but mostly succeeded in making the entire station smell like sulfur mixed with regret. Even the crystalline hegemony, whose species had been manipulating matter at the subatomic level since before most civilizations had invented fire, had admitted defeat with the sort of graceful acceptance that comes from having exhausted every possible solution and several impossible ones. And then there was the human. Dr. Chen sat in the corner of the conference chamber, largely ignored by the assembled alien intelligences who had collectively decided that including a representative from a species that had only recently figured out faster-than-light travel was either a clerical error or someone's idea of cosmic humor. She was small even by human standards, wearing the sort of practical laboratory attire that suggested she had more important things to worry about than impressing interdimensional beings with her fashion sense. The other scientists had been politely dismissive of her presence, treating her contributions to the research effort with the sort of patient tolerance typically reserved for precocious children who insisted on helping with nuclear physics. Her suggestions had been noted, filed, and promptly forgotten in favor of more sophisticated approaches that involved words with at least 7 syllables and theoretical frameworks that required advanced degrees in mathematics just to spell correctly. The irony was delicious. Here was a gathering of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, species that had mastered technologies that bent the very laws of physics to their will, and they were stumped by a problem that would soon be solved by a member of a species that still used petroleum-based transportation and had only recently stopped burning witches for making the weather uncooperative. But none of them knew that yet. The conference chamber continued its symphony of despair, filled with the sort of productive discussion that typically preceded galactic catastrophes. Outside the station's massive viewports, the stars continued their ancient dance, blissfully unaware that their cosmic neighborhood was about to become significantly less crowded if the assembled geniuses couldn't figure out how to stop the Xerathi from dissolving everything that looked at them sideways. Time, as they say, was running out, though in this case it was less running and more sprinting toward a cliff while juggling flaming torches and questioning its life choices. The Xerathi fleet materialized around Research Station Omega-7, with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested they had been practicing their entrance in front of a mirror. 17 crystalline dreadnoughts emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the cold beauty of beings who had weaponized geometry and found it satisfying. Each ship was a work of art that happened to be capable of reducing planets to constituent atoms, the sort of aesthetic choice that spoke to a civilization with very specific ideas about interior decoration. The station's proximity alarms began their cheerful electronic symphony of impending doom, filling the corridors with the kind of urgent beeping that made even the most composed beings consider updating their will. Emergency protocols activated with mechanical efficiency, sealing blast doors and powering up defensive systems that everyone present knew would be about as useful as a chocolate teapot against what was coming for them. Commander Vex Prime's voice resonated through the station's communication system, with the crystalline clarity that made Xerathi so popular at diplomatic functions, and so terrifying during invasion. The translation matrix struggled briefly with concepts that didn't exist in most galactic languages, settling on approximations that conveyed the general sense of polite inevitable destruction. Attention inhabitants of Research Station Omega-7, you have been selected for participation in a compliance verification exercise. Your facility contains classified research materials that present a theoretical threat to galactic stability. We require immediate surrender of all data concerning quantum dissolution countermeasures. The pause that followed was filled with the sort of silence that occurs when an entire station, full of brilliant minds, collectively realizes they have been caught with their metaphorical pants around their ankles. The Xerathi containment field had already activated, wrapping the station in a shimmering energy barrier that made escape about as likely as a Kelhari developing a sense of humor. You have 72 standard hours to comply, Vex Prime continued with the tone of someone reading grocery lists. Failure to surrender the requested materials will result in the implementation of permanent atmospheric reorganization protocols. Please note that this process may cause mild discomfort, temporary loss of molecular cohesion, and complete cessation of existence. We apologize for any inconvenience. The communication channel closed with a soft click that somehow managed to sound smug. In the main conference chamber, panic manifested in species-specific ways that would have been fascinating to observe under different circumstances. The Zephyrian delegates' containment field cycled through colors that didn't have names in most languages, settling on a shade that roughly translated to existential terror, with hints of lavender. The Vorthak representative began calculating probability matrices so frantically that small wisps of smoke emerged from their cranial computation port. The crystalline hegemony's ambassador achieved the remarkable feat of looking worried despite being made entirely of mineral compounds, their faceted surface reflecting the chamber's emergency lighting in patterns that suggested deep philosophical regret. Several of the smaller species delegates had begun what appeared to be elaborate farewell rituals, including one particularly touching ceremony that involved synchronized wing fluttering and the exchange of what were probably meaningful pheromones. 72 hours, wheezed the Kelhari representative through their breathing apparatus, to solve a problem we've been working on for 3 months. This is like asking someone to perform brain surgery with a spoon while blindfolded and writing a unison. The comparison is flawed, observed the Vorthak delegate with mechanical precision. Brain surgery with a spoon would have a higher probability of success. The assembled scientists began talking over each other in a cacophony of languages that created interference patterns in the translation matrix. Accusations flew with the speed of light and about as much accuracy. The Zephyrians suggested that perhaps the human was a Xerathi spy. After all, wasn't it suspiciously convenient that the newest member of the galactic community happened to be present when this crisis emerged? Ridiculous, snapped the crystalline representative, their voice creating harmonic resonances that made the station's hull vibrate. Humans lack the technological sophistication for effective espionage. They've barely mastered interstellar travel. Perhaps that's precisely why they would make ideal operatives, the Kelhari wheezed, their paranoia mixing poorly with their oxygen-poor environment. Who would suspect a species that still uses combustion engines for planetary transportation? Chen observed this display of galactic intelligence, with the sort of detached fascination typically reserved for watching traffic accidents in slow motion. While the representatives of advanced civilizations engaged in what could charitably be described as sophisticated finger-pointing, she continued her analysis of the Dissolution Protocol data, with the methodical patience of someone who had learned early that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her tablet displayed equations that would have given most beings headaches, quantum mechanics principles arranged in patterns that suggested she was approaching the problem from an angle that hadn't occurred to anyone else in the chamber. While the other scientists debated the finer points of blame assignment and developed increasingly creative theories about human treachery, she was busy doing something that apparently hadn't crossed their highly evolved minds, actually trying to solve the problem. The irony was thick enough to cut with a molecular blade. Here were species that had mastered technologies beyond human comprehension, beings whose civilizations had thrived for millennia, and they were spending their final hours arguing about whether the primitive newcomer might be a threat to their carefully ordered universe. Outside the station, the Xerathi fleet maintained its perfect formation, patient as death and twice as certain. Their ship's crystalline hulls caught the light from nearby stars, creating rainbow patterns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been attached to vessels capable of unmaking matter at the fundamental level. Time continued its relentless march toward what most beings in the chamber assumed would be a very brief and unpleasant conclusion to their careers. The countdown had begun, and with each passing moment, the galaxy's brightest minds seemed more convinced that their best hope lay in pointing fingers at each other, rather than at the equations that might save them all. But in the corner of the chamber, ignored by the chaos around her, the human scientist continued her work with the quiet determination of a species that had never learned when to quit. 12 hours remained on the Xerathi deadline, and the station had taken on the atmosphere of a very expensive funeral home where everyone was still breathing, but nobody expected that to continue much longer. The assembled representatives had moved past panic and settled into the sort of resigned despair that comes from accepting that one's life's work was about to be atomized, along with everything else in a several-kilometer radius. The Kelhari delegate had begun composing what they called their final scholarly testament, a document that would presumably survive them by being transmitted to their homeworld before the dissolution party began. The Vorthok had calculated the exact probability of survival so many times that their processors had started smoking, filling their corner of the chamber with the acrid scent of overheated circuits and mathematical desperation. Chen had done something that apparently hadn't occurred to the galaxy's finest minds. She had actually read the Xerathi technical specification, not the sanitized version that had been distributed through diplomatic channels, mind you, the actual engineering documentation that the Xerathi had helpfully included with their ultimatum. Because apparently when you're utterly convinced of your technological superiority, you see no harm in showing your enemies exactly how you plan to unmake them. It was rather like a serial killer mailing blueprints of their death traps to the police, assuming they were too stupid to understand the instruction. The human scientist had spent the past 60 hours doing something her alien colleagues considered either primitive or insane. She had been working through the mathematics by hand, while the other researchers had been feeding the problem into quantum computers capable of processing calculations that would make supernovas look like simple arithmetic. She had been using what the Vorthok dismissively called biological computation, namely, her brain, a writing stylus, and an alarming amount of caffeinated beverages. Her approach would have horrified any properly educated galactic scientist. Instead of elegant quantum modeling or sophisticated molecular simulation, she was using techniques that belonged in a museum of mathematical antiquities: linear algebra, differential equations, calculus, tools so basic that most civilizations had automated them out of existence millennia ago. Fascinating, muttered the crystalline representative, observing her work with the sort of morbid curiosity reserved for watching primitive ritual. The human appears to be attempting manual computation of quantum resonance frequencies. How quaint. But Dr. Chen wasn't attempting anything. She was succeeding. The breakthrough came at hour 67, announced not by fanfare or dramatic revelation, but by a quiet ha that somehow cut through the chamber's despair like a laser through tissue paper. She had been staring at a particular set of equations for the better part of an hour when something clicked in her distinctly human brain. A connection that quantum computers had missed because they were too sophisticated to consider something so elegantly simple. The Dissolution Protocol operated by destabilizing molecular bonds through quantum resonance frequency manipulation. Every atom in the universe vibrated at specific frequencies, and the Xerathi weapon found those frequencies and convinced them to stop cooperating with their neighbor. It was brilliant, devastating, and absolutely unstoppable, except for one tiny detail that apparently nobody had bothered to check. The protocol's quantum field generators operated in a harmonic sequence that created a standing wave pattern, and standing waves by their very nature had nodes, points where the wave energy canceled itself out completely. The Xerathi had built the galaxy's most terrifying weapon around a fundamental principle that contained its own off switch. "Oh, you magnificent, overconfident crystalline bastards," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough to make the nearest alien delegates look up from their preparations for oblivion. Chen stood and cleared her throat with the sort of authority that made everyone in the chamber stop what they were doing and pay attention, despite themselves. In her hands was a tablet displaying equations that looked suspiciously simple compared to the incomprehensible mathematics that had been failing them for months. "I believe," she said with the tone of someone who had just discovered that the Emperor's new clothes were actually invisible, "that we've been overthinking this problem." The Zephyrian's containment field shifted to a color that roughly translated to skeptical hope tinged with inevitable disappointment. The Vorthok delegate's optical sensors focused on her tablet with mechanical precision, while the crystalline representative angled their faceted form to better observe what they assumed would be another example of human naivety. "The Dissolution Protocol," Chen continued, "is fundamentally flawed, and I can prove it." The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems and the distant sound of the Xerathi fleet, maintaining their patient,
deadly vigil outside. The next 8 minutes contained more frantic scientific activity than most civilizations witnessed in a standard decade. Chen's revelation had transformed the conference chamber from a high-tech wake into something resembling a particularly chaotic episode of interdimensional home renovation, complete with sparks, shouting, and the distinct possibility that someone might accidentally create a small singularity. Her proof was embarrassingly simple. The Dissolution Protocol's harmonic sequence created predictable interference patterns that could be mapped using mathematics so basic that several species had automated the calculations out of existence. She demonstrated this by jury-rigging a frequency generator from laboratory equipment that the Vorthak had dismissed as quaint backup systems, and producing a localized nullification field that made a test sample of reactive matter absolutely refuse to dissolve, no matter how politely the quantum frequencies asked. The assembled alien scientists observed this demonstration with the sort of stunned silence typically reserved for watching someone perform brain surgery with kitchen utensils, and somehow succeeding. The crystalline representative actually fractured slightly, a physiological response that indicated either deep shock, or the mineral equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Impossible, wheezed the Kalahari delegate, their breathing apparatus working overtime to process the implication. Our quantum computers analyzed every possible frequency combination. We ran simulations for 3 months. Your quantum computers, Chen replied with the patience of someone explaining basic arithmetic to exceptionally slow children, were looking for complex solutions to what they assumed was a complex problem. Sometimes the most sophisticated approach is to try the simple one first. The Vorthak delegates' optical sensors flickered in patterns that suggested their worldview was undergoing rapid and uncomfortable recalibration. You solved a galactic crisis using undergraduate mathematics and coffee. Don't forget the coffee. Commander Vex Prime's final ultimatum arrived precisely on schedule, delivered with the sort of crystalline certainty that suggested the Xerathi had never encountered a deadline they couldn't keep. Compliance period has expired. Initiating Dissolution Protocol in 60 seconds. We suggest you spend this time reflecting on the choices that brought you to this moment. The station's defensive grid hummed to life under Dr. Chen's modifications, frequency generators that had been hastily repurposed from equipment designed to calibrate interdimensional sensors. The other scientists watched with the sort of morbid fascination reserved for witnessing either a miracle or the most spectacular failure in recorded galactic history, possibly both considering how these things typically 30 seconds, announced Vex Prime with the emotional range of a particularly efficient calculator. Please note that dissolution may cause temporary disorientation, complete molecular dispersal, and voided warranties on all electronic equipment. Chen's fingers danced across her improvised control system, with the casual confidence of someone who had just realized that the galaxy's most feared weapon was essentially a very expensive way to vibrate atoms in predictable pattern. The defensive grid synchronized with her calculations, creating a harmonic interference field that would either neutralize the protocol or turn everyone on the station into very surprised subatomic particles. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Dissolution Protocol active. The Xerathi fleet unleashed their masterpiece with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested they had been looking forward to this moment. 17 dreadnoughts fired simultaneously, their weapons creating a convergence pattern that should have reduced Research Station Omega-7 to its constituent atoms in the span of a heartbeat. Instead, something considerably more interesting happened. The Dissolution Protocol struck Chen's interference field and underwent what could politely be described as an identity crisis. The quantum frequencies that were supposed to convince atoms to stop cooperating with each other encountered harmonic nodes that made them reconsider their life choices. The weapon's energy reflected back along its own transmission path, with the sort of devastating efficiency that occurs when unstoppable forces meet immovable objects and decide to switch sides. 17 Xerathi dreadnoughts, constructed with crystalline precision and armed with enough firepower to sterilize solar systems, discovered what it felt like to have their own molecular bonds politely asked to cease existing. The effect was rather like watching dominoes fall, if dominoes were made of exotic matter, and falling meant ceasing to exist in a cascade of confused particles. The flagship lasted approximately 3 seconds longer than its escorts, long enough for Commander Vex Prime to transmit a final message that consisted entirely of frequencies that translated roughly to, "What in the name of crystalline perfection just happened?" Then it too joined the growing cloud of bewildered atoms that had recently been the galaxy's most feared military force. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the station's life support systems, and the distant sound of the Kalahari delegates' breathing apparatus, struggling to process what had just occurred. Outside the viewports, where 17 dreadnoughts had moments before maintained perfect formation, there was nothing but empty space and a faint luminescent glow that might have been the universe's way of saying oops. "Well," said Chen, powering down her improvised defense system, with the casual air of someone who had just fixed a particularly stubborn piece of household equipment that worked better than I expected. The Zephyrian delegates' containment field cycled through approximately 47 different colors, before settling on a shade that roughly translated to existential confusion mixed with grudging respect. The Vorthak had begun recalculating probability matrices so frantically that small wisps of smoke emerged from their processing centers. The crystalline representative began, then stopped, their faceted form reflecting the chamber's lights, in patterns that suggested they were having difficulty with basic concepts, like cause and effect. Turned their own weapon against them using math that most of your civilizations forgot existed, Dr. Chen finished helpfully. The Xerathi spent so much time perfecting their dissolution technology that they forgot to check whether it was vulnerable to its own principle. Pride, as it turns out, is a universal constant. The implications settled over the chamber like a particularly heavy blanket. The galaxy's newest member, a species that still used chemical rockets for some of its space travel, had just neutralized the most technologically advanced military force in known space, using equipment that most civilizations would have considered museum pieces, and she had done it in under 12 hours. The emergency session that followed would be remembered as the moment when humanity officially graduated from interesting curiosity to species we should probably listen to more often. Though it would take several more decades for the full ramifications to be understood, the message was clear. Sometimes the most sophisticated problems required the most elegant solutions, and sometimes the best solutions came from the species that everyone assumed was too primitive to matter. The galaxy, as it turned out, had been thinking about things the wrong way all along,